Welcome to the OK Let's Learn podcast, where we dive into books and stories in our OK Book Club, and we dive into people and tons of different topics. My name is Kevin O'Keefe. So, today, let's learn about James and Dolley Madison. Yes, the fourth president of the United States and his wife, who for my generation, you may only know of Dolley Madison from the snacks cakes and the ice cream. They were right there in the supermarket next to the Yodels and the Ring Dings. But Dolley Madison was one of the most popular and certainly respected first ladies in our country's history. And as a matter of fact, the first time we called the wife of the President of the United States the First Lady was with Dolley Madison. But her husband, James Madison, became ultimately the father of our Constitution, and both of them have a fascinating life. So long before he was our president, James Madison was a sickly, small boy who grew up in a large plantation in central Virginia called Montpelier. He was born on March 16th, 1751. And right from the beginning, he was different. He was a different kid. He was tiny, he was short, he was frail, and his health was not good. Historians actually look back on it, and there were a lot of digestive issues. And, spoiler alert, he ended up living a long, healthy life for this time period. He lived to age 85, but early on, he did not ultimately go to war. He wasn't in the Revolutionary War, and he didn't participate out even in the family farm because he was too sickly. They ultimately thought it was some version of Crohn's disease, but he could barely work. So how did he make up for that? He read every book that was possible. He was a smart kid. He was homeschooled pretty much his entire upbringing. He spent most of his time, as I mentioned, indoors. His father had a huge library, and his dad called him affectionately Jemmy. And like I said, he devoured every book he could find, whether it was history, philosophy, ancient civilizations, everything fascinated him. So while all the other kids were outside playing, James Madison was quietly teaching himself, how governments worked and why some succeeded and some failed. This kind of quiet nature stayed with him his whole life. He was very much introverted, like I said, obviously smart, but shy, serious, and very reflective. He didn't bring attention to himself. He didn't like large, loud crowds. Like I said, he kept to himself. And at 17 years old, he attended the College of New Jersey. And if you're a resident of the College of New Jersey, my daughter went there. Back then, it wasn't the College of New Jersey. It was known as Princeton University. Yes. And his love of learning exploded. He studied Latin and Greek, ancient political thinkers, and he spent hours debating with a lot of his classmates. He pushed himself so hard that, he finished Princeton University in 2 years, which at that time, still today, is an amazing accomplishment. Now, as I've mentioned throughout my many podcasts, so many historical figures, the reason that they're very important and they stood out is very often it was luck. They were at the right place at the right time. And here he is, James Madison, at 23 years old, just newly out of college as a lawyer, and it's 1774. Right as the American Revolution is about to begin, the tensions are exploding with the mother country, England. And what he ended up doing was he became a leader in Virginia's first representative Congress. It was called the House of Burgesses. And this was historic. This government in Virginia was the first time that it was actually set up very early on after Jamestown. And it was actually done in a way that, no, the king did not rule. The king didn't send a representative in to run the states. This was a body of gentlemen that were elected by the citizens, the landowners of Virginia, that basically said, you know what, we're going to run this new colony here of Virginia by us, the people. So he was one of the elected leaders, and he honed his debate skills in representing people. And you know what? This set the foundation of his later work. And of course, then the Revolutionary War broke out, and he didn't fight, like I said, because of his health, but he served with his mind. After the war ended, he faced this huge challenge that he ended up helping in the Constitutional Convention of 1787. He was one of the few men who went to Philadelphia to figure out, this Articles of Confederation, we got our new country set up, and these individual 13 new states are not working. They're not getting along. We need to set up a better system of government. And he was known ultimately as the father of the Constitution because he was intimately involved in setting up, number one, the legislative branch to make the laws, the executive branch led by the president to carry out the laws, and the judicial branch, the branch of government that basically said, okay, you got a law here, is this really fair? Three branches of government that ultimately had checks and balances on each so that one area of government wasn't too strong. His counterpart, Alexander Hamilton, that I talked about in our previous podcast of the year 1811, he wanted a strong federal government, and James Madison pushed back with that. But what James Madison did more than anything else was to alleviate and not have the strong federal government be so powerful. He put rights in the Constitution at the very end. It was called the Bill of Rights, that gave individual liberties power and written down in the law of the land that, you know what? We have freedom of speech. We have the freedom of the press. We can do everything as an individual without worrying about our government taking over these God-given rights. So when they wrote this piece of paper, this Constitution in Philadelphia, the states had to ratify it. So to help get the word out, he was responsible for writing what we call the Federalist Papers. Himself, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay put the word out as to why the states should ratify this new piece of paper with these checks and balances in there and have this country really work. So because of all the great work he did, ultimately he became our fourth president of the United States, and he led our country through the War of 1812. But along with all this brilliance, his personality was such that, he was an older man, he was single, and clearly not flashy and outgoing, and that's where Dolley Madison ended up stepping in. Here is a bachelor, someone that's never been married, no children, and this beautiful woman ends up coming in, and her maiden name was Payne, Payne. She was born in 1768 and grew up in a very loving, lively Quaker household in Pennsylvania. She was fashionable, friendly, like I said. She was loved by everyone around her. But life really was hard early on. She married young. She had 2 sons, but tragedy struck. Yellow fever swept through the entire country and hit her family hard. Her husband and her youngest son passed away, leaving Dolly widowed at just 25 years old. Despite her grief, she still didn't change her personality. She got back up. She was resilient. She leaned on friends and family. And it was through some of her friends that she met James Madison in 1793. Like I said, they couldn't have been more different. James was quiet, reserved, and Dolley was lively, magnetic. Yet, of course, they fit together perfectly. They were married the next year in 1794. James Madison was 43 years old, and his young wife was 26. They never had children of their own, and after they moved into the White House, it was during the War of 1812 that Dolley became a national hero when she saved tons of American treasures, the most famous being the portrait of George Washington that was huge up on the wall. As the British troops were literally just an hour or two away from entering the building and burning it down, she took it out and saved it. After their presidency, both of them ended up returning to Montpelier. James Madison continued writing, advising future leaders, and Dolley became active. Again, loved for her kindness and her grace and just really impeccable character. Ultimately, James Madison died in 1836 at the age of 85. They said it was heart failure, but like I said, at that time, 85 is a long, prosperous life. It looks like it was about 13 years later in 1849, at the age of 81, Dolley passed away. She had a period of few strokes. James Madison, his legacy lives on, not only in the Constitution and being one of our presidents, getting us through you could argue, most important war, our first war after independence that allowed us to enter the world stage and be a dominant country right along with France and England. Well, his legacy also lives on in a university named after him, JMU, James Madison University, in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And yes, I have two nephews that went to this college. Both of them, these two, together remind us, that history is shaped not just by strength and power, but with ideas, character, and compassion. So to wrap up our podcast, let's look at some fun facts. The 10 most interesting facts about Dolley Madison and James Madison. James Madison is up first. A couple honorable mentions before we get into the countdown. He had a great quote. "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." Out of all his writings, that's one, at least for me, that sticks out. And a few important, interesting things that happened while he was the president. We'll talk about this, but as I've mentioned, the White House was burned down while he was the president. He became very, very unpopular during that time. You can imagine. But the actual name for the White House, it was originally painted in white, but with the scars of the remaining walls that were still standing with the White House, they repainted all the charred and black remains on the walls, and informally, it just took off in terms of it being called the quote-unquote White House. And yes, the Star-Spangled Banner was written during the War of 1812 while he was president. Francis Scott Key at the Battle of Baltimore defending Fort McHenry. And his backstory, he was the oldest of 12 children, and most of his siblings died young, which was so sad, but it was common for the time. And his parents, both rich, father was a wealthy plantation owner, and so he was raised in privilege. And finally, listen to this. He had two vice presidents that passed away while he was president. Now, remember, he was president for 8 years. But George Clinton passed away, who was the former governor of New York and was so instrumental in the building of the Erie Canal. And Elbridge Gerry, he passed away. So when he ended his term in office, he didn't even have a vice president. Now, those of you, the adults out there, you may Remember, that name may sound familiar. Yeah, he gave us the word gerrymandering. Elbridge Gerry. All right, so number 10 for James Madison. We've talked about this before. He wasn't even hardly 100 pounds. That's how much he weighed. Imagine that. He was not only the lightest president ever, the shortest president ever, coming in at 5 feet 4 inches tall. There was a quote that I found that just was amazing to me. Someone had mentioned casting aspersions on James Madison. He was no bigger than a half a piece of soap. Could James Madison be president today in a culture that just defines looks as being so important? I'm not going to comment on that. It's a sad reality, but the bottom line is what makes up a person is not what you look like. What makes up a person is your heart and your character and your soul. That's what's important. And James Madison had all of that. Number 9, the way he dressed. He dressed all in black very often. He was the first president to wear long pants. If you look at all these pictures back in the time, the first 3 presidents, and very often during this time, they wore knee breeches, which were pants that just ended just below the knee. They're still around today, but they were fastened with buttons and buckles at the knee, and they were worn typically with long stockings and low shoes, and they were very popular for, obviously people during that time were on horses, so it was more conducive to galloping with the horse, but he was the first person that just started wearing long pants, so that was clearly interesting. And also, he had blue eyes, and he had a scar on his nose when he was in college, walking a lot outside, and the scar apparently happened because of frostbite. Number 8, he established with Thomas Jefferson the first political party, the Democratic Republican Party. And in fact, the early founders wanted to stay away from political parties. Even back then, they knew the dangers that that could represent, and we still see that today with all the partisan politics, the division and the disagreements that we have. There's benefits to that, but a lot of people would say, well, you know what, James, that's not the best part about your record. Now, briefly, the evolution of our political parties today, where you think of, well, we got the Democrats and the Republicans today, there's not a direct line that you can travel to put 2 and 2 together. This party is representative of this party today. Well, back then, basically, the Democratic Republican Party, even though you got both names in that name, it was known as the Jeffersonian Republicans. But the bottom line is James Madison and Thomas Jefferson's early party favored state rights, and the opposing party was called the Federalist, and that was primarily Alexander Hamilton's ideas of a strong federal government. So these were the 2 opposing parties as our country started during this time period of James Madison's presidency, and ultimately the parties evolved. Historians say that this Democratic Republican Party started by James Madison evolved into our present-day Democratic Party. And ultimately, from the Federalists, we went through the Whigs, and then during the time of Abraham Lincoln, we had the establishment of the Republican Party, which we still have today. Number 7, he owned slaves. Like a lot of our early founders, it's a sad reality, but it's true. He owned a plantation, Montpelier, and yes, he inherited this from his family, his mother and father. Number 6, although he was land rich, he was cash poor. He had financial problems all through his life. And yes, you would think, oh my goodness, plantation, tobacco, money. No, tobacco was not profitable during this time. And we'll discuss this in a little bit with his wife. His stepson was a gambler, lost lots of money. He was thrown in debtor's prison. They were always bailing him out. Believe it or not, during this time, if you owed money, you were thrown in prison. So ultimately, a big financial strain was their son. And believe it or not, he was actually turned down. A president of the United States was turned down for a bank loan from a major bank during this time. Number 5, he was the only president to take on enemy fire. Definitely a future episode, something so fascinating. But on August 24th, 1814, the British marched into Washington and burned the White House down. He wasn't in the White House during the time. His wife was, which we'll talk about later, but ultimately he was on the outskirts. He was planning responses, what they were going to do, and incoming fire became a reality. Number 4, he had probably more than any other president, so many important partnerships. First and primarily with Thomas Jefferson, the third president, who wrote the Declaration of Independence. You had George Washington that he worked with consistently during George Washington's first term. You had Alexander Hamilton, although they literally disagreed on how government should be run. They worked together to get the states to ratify our Constitution. And yes, even James Monroe, who they had major disagreements with, he ultimately had him as his Secretary of State, and he succeeded him as president. So much of what we see today, you know what? There were disagreements with our founding fathers, no doubt, but a lot of them, thankfully, worked together. Number 3, he was smart. This was by far his best attribute, and he took advantage of it. By the age of 11, he had read all the books in his father's library, 85 of them. By the time he was 16, getting into Princeton University early, leaving the university early, like I mentioned earlier. But he was reading Plato and a lot of the Greek philosophers. And this wasn't just translated versions. He taught himself how to read Greek, the Greek language. Number 2, and this is so often overlooked, even with people today. He was a public servant. He worked not to make money. He was not in private affairs. He worked to help, in this case, our early government. Listen to what he did. At 23, right out of college, he immediately was elected to Virginia's government, the House of Burgesses, the first representative government done by the people, for the people, right? So that was number 1. Number 2, he ended up being in the Continental Congress, which was the government that was overseeing us in the Revolutionary War. Very important. Ultimately, then, he became a congressman from Virginia, the first Congress, and he helped work with George Washington. Very, very important. Then he became Secretary of State with Thomas Jefferson, which at the time is basically helping us on the world stage, working throughout our relationships with other countries. And yes, then ultimately he became president, and then he helped shape and ran the University of Virginia. And finally, number 1, this cannot be overstated. His legacy is he's the father of the Constitution. Why? He was the primary author of the law of our land that still is around today. And yes, he authored the Bill of Rights, which was at the very end, the first 10 amendments. This was a tough one to get through, and it's such an interesting topic and is worthy of its own episode, no question. The fact that each of us don't have to worry about what we say, we can practice our own religion, we are right as an individual, we have a right to a fair trial, our punishments have to be fair, humane, so many individual rights that are written down. They are the law. And it's not a stretch to say that our quality of life today goes back to this early foundation, making sure that individual liberties and rights are the law of the land, and this came from James Madison. Okay, let's get on to his wife. The top 10 most interesting parts about Dolley Madison. Number 10, She was the official hostess, like the first hostess. The job of the First Lady really started with her. But what she was a person that loved people. And she brought together, during this time, a lot of the disagreements that happened in terms of getting compromise, working together in government, happened face to face. And it was mostly in these social settings, which were entirely set up by Dolley Madison very often. She had these Wednesday evening get-togethers, and ultimately the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans were invited to all these events that she set up. And it's interesting, one of her most famous quotes is, "Politics is the business of men. I only care about people." And when you are in social settings, when your defenses are down and you're just talking person to person, it becomes so important to get to know not only people that you respect and that you admire and that you're friends with, but your enemies, so to speak, your people that you have disagreements with. You ultimately find out you have more together that you share and you agree with that you really disagree with. So this cannot be understated how much she brought people together. Number 9, this was important, but because of her social status and people really listened to her, along with her husband, after Washington, D.C. and the White House was burned down, there was talk about moving the Capitol back to Philadelphia. There was a lot of talk about that, but she advocated big time about keeping the Capitol there in Washington, D.C. And keep in mind, this was very important to the early establishment of our country, keeping the South and the North together, the early colonies, and even the future states. If you're just having the capital and the power be way up north, the South at this time, this is a time where, it took forever to travel. So having the capital right smack in the middle between the North and the South was very important. So Dolley Madison kept our capital in Washington, D.C. And like I said, it could have been so easy to move. As a matter of fact, they lived, after the White House was burned down, they lived in this octagon house. And that house is still there today in Washington, D.C. Number 8. Talk about a sign of how respected she was. She was given an honorary lifetime seat on the floor of the House of Representatives. This is not something that was done then or even since. Basically, as a private citizen, you don't sit on the House floor. You only have members of Congress, certain designated officials, and aides of the congressional staffers, but that's it. So, very interesting. Number 7. This is done all the time now, but she was the first one to host the inaugural ball after Inauguration Day. Number 6, we talked about this before with her husband, but unfortunately, her only son gave her much grief throughout her life, and ultimately she became very, very poor. At the end of her life, she had to move off of her plantation, go back to Washington, D.C., and rely on friends and family. Very sad. Number 5, which we talked about a lot earlier in the podcast, but it was her stature, how she looked, right? Because she was so much taller. There is this fun little anecdote that I've read about, that they loved each other. They had so much fun together. Because he was so much smaller than her, she gave him piggyback rides in their home. Yes. Number 4 was her upbringing. She was a Quaker originally from her parents growing up in Virginia. They moved to Philadelphia early in her life. And as I mentioned, she had tragedy that struck with the yellow fever in Philadelphia. And yes, because she married James Madison, who was a non-Quaker, she was excommunicated from the Quaker community. Amazing. Number 3, her personality. Yes. We've referenced this before, but listen to these quotes. Her sister talked about the fact that, and I just think this is a wonderful quote, and you talk about an attribute that everyone wants to aspire to. It's simple, but it says so much. Her sister basically said, everyone feels better for having spent time with her. So simple, right? But so meaningful. And the other one was, yes, Dolly, everybody loves you, was said to her. And then Dolly says back, yes, because Dolly loves everybody. Again, it's just a lot of the writings that survived. Most people, it's clear, adored her. Number two, again, along with her husband, it was her appearance, but it was specifically how she dressed. She had elaborate headdresses, turbans, and there were ostrich feathers. So she made sure that she stood out. So, the number one fact about Dolly Madison that you have to know, it was when the White House was burned down. Hours before, as they were approaching, she is up on the roof, looking out, finding out what is happening. And yes, she took every precaution to save as much as she could, and she did. Her most valuable artifact item that she saved was the famous Gilbert Stuart painting of George Washington. It was so difficult to get off the wall. It was bolted into the wall. She made a split-second decision to literally break open the glass, smash open the glass, and she literally took the painting with her helpers and rolled it up and left with it. I mean, the painting was huge with the huge frame. It wasn't like you could just lift it off the wall. And this painting is still there in the White House today after all these years in the East Room. It's the only item that started out in the White House in 1800 and is still there today. And that's all because of Dolly Madison. Yes, one moment, one day, one event, but so representative of who she was. She was thinking of others. She was thinking of her country before herself. Friends, thanks for taking this journey on learning about James and Dolley Madison. Reach out to me at kevmok21@gmail.com. Thoughts, ideas, opinions. What would you like to hear for an episode in the future? I always love being able to read some nice reviews on Apple Podcasts, so that's always appreciated. So until next time, have fun and keep learning.